like the game of Stone Age, first separate the food tokens by value and place them in the hunting ground. Place the different resources in their places on the board. The wood in the forest, the bricks in the clay pit, the stones in the quarry, and the gold in the river. Separate the 1, 2 tools from the 3 and 4 tools and place them in the 2 tool spaces. The 1s and 3s should be face up in the piles. Shuffle the civilization cards and place them face down in a pile next to this area of the board. Flip up the top 4 cards and place them from right to left. Shuffle the building tiles and place them into piles of 7, equal to the number of players. So, if 4 players are playing, there will be 4 piles of 7 tiles. Flip up the top tile of each pile. Players choose a color and place one marker on the 0 space of the food track, and the other on the 0 of the scoring track. Place the dice cup and dice next to the game board, along with 5 people of each player's color. Each player gets a player board, the other 5 people of their chosen color, and 12 food pieces. A start player is chosen and they receive the start player marker. Now players are ready to move into phase 1. During phase 1, players are placing their people from their player board to locations on the game board. They are ultimately trying to place on locations to get resources, to buy civilization cards and buildings in an attempt to score the most points. The person with the start player marker will always be the first player to place their people. They will always place one or more people figure on a location on the board. After the start player places, the next player in clockwise order will place one or more people figures for their turn. If at any time during the phase a player has no more people figures to play during their turn, they are skipped, and the next player places their people. Each location has limits on how many people markers can be placed there, indicated by rings in that area. Let's take a look at each location. The locations they can place on include the tool marker. One player is able to place here. The hut. A player that places here must always place 2 of their people. The field. One player may place 1 people marker here. In a 2 or 3 player game, only 2 of the tool marker, hut, or field areas may be played on. The other one must be left empty. The hunt area is the area near the food tokens. This area has no limit on the amount of people figures that can be placed there. There are also 4 resource areas players can place their people markers on. These each have 7 spaces for people markers to be placed. In a 2-player game, only 1 player may place their people in one of the resource spaces. So in this example, the yellow player has already placed in the forest, so now nobody else is able to place in the forest during this round. In a 3-player game, only 2 players may place their people in any of the resource spaces. So in this example, both yellow and green were able to place in the forest. In a 4-player game, players may place their people figures in these areas until all 7 rings are occupied. Each civilization card may have 1 people figure placed on it, as indicated by the 1 circle on the card. And each building tile may have 1 people figure placed on it. One final note for players when they are placing on locations is that they do not have to be able to complete the requirements of the location they placed on. For example, if someone knew their opponent wanted to gain this building tile, they could place a people figure on it even if they didn't have the resources required, just to block the other player from gaining the tile. After all players have placed all of their people figures, they move into phase 2. In phase 2, players use the actions of the locations they placed on during phase 1. The starting player begins by assessing each location they placed on one at a time. They may do this in any order they wish. This is important because a player may need the items from one location to complete an action from another location. Every time a player completes the action of a location they placed on, they remove their people figure and return it to their player board. As mentioned in the Phase 1 video, players do not have to use the action of the location they placed on. If they do not use the action, they simply return their people figure to their board. After the start player has completed all their actions and removed all of their people back to their player board, the player to their left does the same. This continues in clockwise order until all players have removed all of their people back to their game boards. Let's take a look at the individual benefits each location gives a player. Any player placed on the tool marker space gets a tool marker. Tool markers are placed in one of these 3 boxes on the player board. They are placed in the following way. If it is the first tool gained, it is always a number 1 tool, and it is placed in the top box. If and only if a player has all spaces filled with 1 tools, their next tool changes a 1 tool into a 2 tool. This pattern continues with all tools being changed to 2s before being swapped out for 3 tools. And then all tools being 3 tools before being flipped to 4 tools. Tools are a great asset in the game. During the game, players will roll dice to try to gain resources. Tool markers allow a player to increase their dice roll the exact amount of the tool to help them gain more resources. Players may use as many of their tools as they would like during a dice roll, but each tool may only be used once during the phase. When they use a tool, they turn it 90 degrees to show that it has been used. So this roll of 8 could be increased to 12, 16, or even 20 if a player used their tools. Any player that has placed 2 of their people in the hut has reproduced and gains a people figure of their matching color from the 5 placed there at the beginning of the game. The new people figure gained will be placed on their player board with the rest of their people. A player that placed in the field moves their player marker up 1 on the food track. The next spaces to be explained are completed using dice rolls. These areas include the hunt and all 4 resource spaces. First, let's look at how the dice rolling mechanic works, and then we'll look at the spaces individually. When rolling dice for an area, a player will always do the following steps. First, they will count up all the people they placed in that area. Then, they will roll dice equal to that amount of people. The value of all the dice is added up, and a player may decide to use any tools to increase the die roll value. Then the player divides the value of the dice plus any tools by the number for that area. In the hunt, the number is 2. In the forest, 3. In the clay pit, 4. In the quarry, it's 5. And in the river, it's 6. After the player divides by the number of the area they are in, they round the number down and gain that number of resources. Any player who plays on a civilization card decides whether or not to buy the card. If they decide to buy it, they count the symbols above the card and pay that amount of resources, from 1 resource in this area all the way up to 4 resources for a card in this area. They may pay either wood, clay, stone, or gold, and are allowed to mix resource types. All resources paid are returned to their supply area. When they buy the card, they take it and complete the action shown on the top of the card. Let's take a look at the individual top symbols and what they give players after the card is purchased. Some cards have symbols like this. To use this, a player takes the amount of dice equal to the number of players in the game and rolls them. They match the dice they rolled to the corresponding areas on the card. Then they select one of the die and take the item matching that number. A 6 moves them up 1 space on the food track. A 5 gives the player 1 tool. They will place this on their player board the same way they do with other tool markers. And the remaining numbers give a player the resource shown. After the player who purchased the card chooses a die, all other players choose a die in clockwise order until all die have been claimed and the players have taken the corresponding items. Other cards have a resource shown with dice next to them. These allow a player to roll 2 dice, add any unused tool amounts to increase the die value, and then divide by the number used for that resource, round down, and gain that number of the resource. Cards that have food symbols on them gain a player that amount of food. These symbols give food production, which allows a player to move their marker up 1 on the food track. Cards that have a resource or resources shown on the top give a player that resource or resources. This symbol gives a player 1 tool. They gain tools with the exact same rules explained previously. This symbol gives a player the top card from the Civilization deck. The player is allowed to look at the card, but does not do the action on the top. They simply place the card face down in this area of their player board. These cards have points on them, and the player who bought the card immediately moves up that number of points on the scoring track. Players always do the actions immediately after purchasing the card, and then place the card face down in this area of their player board. There are 2 types of cards that can be either played immediately or saved for a one-time use later. The first type of card has this symbol. This allows a player to take 2 resources of their choice. The resources can either be the same or different, but they must be gained together at the same time. The other type of card that can be saved gives a player a one-time tool value of that number. So with this card, a player could add 4 to 1 dice roll. Whenever a player decides to save any cards, they place them face up next to their player board. When they finally decide to use the card, they place it face down on their player board. Finally, any player placed on a building tile has the choice of purchasing the building tile. The bottom of the tile tells the cost of the building, and the top of the tile tells the points the building scores the player. There are several tiles that tell the exact resource cost of the building and the exact number of points. And there are several buildings that have a variable cost and score a player a variable amount of points. The costs of buildings like these are broken up into 2 parts. On the left side are the total number of resources a player must pay for the building. And on the right side is the amount of types a player must pay with. So this one requires a player to pay with exactly 2 types of resources. So, for example, this building could be purchased with these resources, gold and stone. There are 2 types, and there are 4 total resources. Buildings such as this give players the most choice of what they pay for the building. A player is allowed to pay anywhere from 1 to 7 resources of any type. The scoring for any of these buildings with the question mark are done in the same way. Each resource used has a value. It is the same value that is shown on the player board. So each gold a player uses to pay for a building earns them 6 points. Each stone earns them 5, bricks earns them 4, and each wood earns them 3 points. So if a player decided to buy this building tile with these resources, they would gain 6 points for each gold piece and 5 points for the stone, for a total of 23 points. All building tiles purchased are placed in this area of the player board. If a player has filled all 5 of their building spaces, they stack any other buildings they purchase. When all actions have been used and all people have been removed from the board, players move into Phase 3. In Phase 3, all players must use their food to feed their people on their player board. They first gain food tokens from the supply equal to their position on the food track. So this player would gain the value of 3 food tokens. Then they count up the total amount of people figures they have on their player board. Each of their people figures needs 1 food. This player has 5 people figures, so they would use 5 food to feed their people. If they do not have enough food to feed all of their people, they can choose to use 1 resource of any type in place of 1 food. Any food or resources used are placed back into the general supply. If any player does not have enough food or resources to take the place of food, they immediately return all of the food they do have to the general supply and lose 10 points. When Phase 3 is complete, a new round starts. The start player marker is moved to the player to the left of the current start player. Any remaining civilization cards are moved all the way to the right, and the empty spaces are filled with cards from the top of the deck. Flip the top building tile of each stack if necessary, so each stack has one face-up building tile. All players' tools are refreshed to their unused positions. Players are now ready to move back into Phase 1, with the new start player beginning the phase. The game ends in one of two ways. First, if there are not enough civilization cards to refill all of the spaces at the end of the round, the game ends immediately. Secondly, if one of the stacks of the building tiles on the game board runs out. In this scenario, players will continue playing through the round as usual, and after they feed their people for that round, the game ends. Whenever the game ends, players will do their final scoring. For final scoring, players are concerned with the civilization cards they purchased during the game. They will look at the bottom half of each civilization card they purchased. First, they will separate any of their tan-bottomed cards from their green-bottomed cards. While scoring the green-bottomed cards, players look at the symbols on the card. They will sort their cards by like symbol. If they have any repeat symbols, they will be stacked on top of each other. Then they count up the number of unique symbols that they have and multiply that number by itself. For instance, this player has 4 unique symbols, and they would multiply that by 4 to get 16 points. If a player had 5 unique symbols, they would multiply 5 times 5 to get 25 points. This multiplying effect only works for one set of unique symbols. So if a player has any matching symbols, they only gain 1 point per card. While scoring the tan-bottomed cards, a player sorts their cards by symbol type. Each card will have one of 4 symbols on the right side: food, tool, people, or hut. After separating by type, the people on the left will be counted for each symbol. These cards will give the following points. Players that have cards with a food symbol will multiply their number of people by their level on the food track. So this player would have 3 people times 8 on the food track to give them 24 points. Players with cards with the tool symbol add up the total value of their tools on their player board and multiply it by the number of people. So this player has 7 tools times 1 would give them 7 points. For the hut symbol, a player counts all of their building tiles on their player board and multiplies that number by the number of people on the card. So this player has 4 building tiles times 2 would give them 8 points. For the people symbol, a player multiplies the number of people figures they have on their player board times the number of people on the card. So this player has 5 people figures times 1 to give them 5 points. Players move up their scoring marker for each of these items that they score. If there is a tie at the end of the game, the player with the highest level on the food track, the highest tool value, and the most people is the winner.